Hey, what's up guys, it's Matt with the Movement System. In this video, we're gonna talk about why most people train their hip flexors the wrong way with C and D tier exercises like this and like this. And this is important because it's leading to a lot of wasted time and lack of progress. So first, we're gonna cover why the most popular hip flexor exercises are actually the least effective. Then we'll cover what actually does work for building a strong, robust hip flexor. We'll cover the exact exercises, sets, reps, and progressions so that way you know exactly what to do. So by the end of this video, you'll know the S tier hip flexor exercises and you'll be ahead of everyone else when it comes to building a strong hip flexor. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Okay. So let's start by analyzing some of the most popular hip flexor exercises that you see online. For example, like this hip end range liftoff. I've seen tons of variations of this same exercise and they all have the exact same problem. And that is that they're training the hip flexor in a shortened position. And there's actually some science behind why this is ineffective. When your muscle is shortened, there's a lot of overlap of what's called actin and myosin. In fact, there's too much overlap, so that way your muscle can't produce very much force. That would be like training a bicep curl only in the very top position, or training a calf raise only at the very top of the range of motion. This is actually the exact opposite of what we want to be doing to build strength. In fact, there's emerging evidence that the lengthened position is the most important part of the repetition. For example, the stretch at the bottom of a calf raise or the stretch at the end of a chest fly. So when we're thinking about how to effectively strengthen the hip flexor, it should be obvious that training in a lengthened position is important. The overall takeaway is actually really simple here. Training in a shortened position falls short. Now that we know that end range liftoffs aren't the best exercise for building hip flexor strength, we should talk about what exercises are a better choice. So if end range liftoffs were D tier, then I would put the next most popular hip flexor exercise, the hip flexor march, a little bit higher in B tier. The hip flexor march is convenient and it does take the hip flexor through a larger range of motion than end range liftoffs. However, the band doesn't develop much tension until the hip flexor is really shortened. So in a way, it's kind of similar to those end range liftoffs, primarily loading the hip flexor in that really shortened position. We can improve this a little bit by actually attaching a band behind the body and taking that hip flexor into hip extension. This is actually a big improvement for runners especially because during sprinting, the hip flexor produces 9 times body weight forces to drive that knee forward. And it has to produce that force when the leg is behind the body with a lot of momentum and reverse that momentum to drive the knee forward. This is why having a weak hip flexor can lead to a lower knee drive and less powerful sprint mechanics. So to get to A tier level exercises, we actually want to look at the way that sprinters are training their hip flexor. So let's take a look at one of those A tier hip flexor exercises with Sidney McLaughlin's machine hip flexor drill. This machine is not only pushing the knee down at the top of the rep, but at the bottom of the rep, it's pushing the knee back. This is a much better resistance profile for the movement to effectively load the hip flexor through the range of motion. And that's why I would consider this an A tier hip flexor drill. But what if, like me, you don't have a machine like this? Well, that's okay because I actually have an S tier drill that you can do at the gym with typical gym equipment. And this drill actually comes from legendary strength coach, the author of this book, Special Strength Training, Yuri Verkhoshansky. So here's the drill. And what you can see in this image from the book is that there's a couple variations of this drill that are used for track and field athletes, sprinters, pole vaulters, hurdle athletes to strengthen their hip flexor through an extended position. So let's go and show you how you can actually do these drills. One variation involves leaning back on a bench for resistance and then either hooking a kettlebell on the foot or using something like a monkey foot to add weight to the foot. And then from there, you just simply march the knee up and then back down. You actually don't have to go all the way into hip flexion. You can do what's called a lengthened partial here and focus on that extended position. It can be helpful to hold on to something for support here, as well as raising up the seat of the bench to put your foot on it for stability here. You really just want one leg hanging off the edge and then to be able to slow and controlled extend that leg down and then drive the knee up. As you can tell with this exercise, you're actually now finally loading that hip flexor with a challenging weight in hip extension, where the hip's back behind the body. And this is very similar to sprinting mechanics. And that's why this drill is actually so effective and so important. The resistance is specifically maximized in a position of hip extension. And this is actually very similar to doing a lengthened partial for the calf, just going through the bottom position of the repetition. Remember, if we're thinking about the biomechanics of sprinting, the hip flexor needs to be strong to reverse the momentum of the leg behind the body and drive that knee forward. So that's what we're specifically training with a position like this. Now, there is a variation of this though that I think is even more effective, but it is very challenging and it's kind of awkward to set up. But here's what that looks like. This would involve hanging from the squat rack and then placing one foot on the top of either a tall box or a bench or even on the shoulder of another athlete. If you have a group of athletes doing this, this could be an effective way to do this exercise. From here, one leg that you're working that hip flexor is going to reach down into hip extension. The opposite leg, you're going to be working the glute and the hamstring. This reciprocal pattern is really beneficial for athletes, and we see a lot of high-level sprinters and hurdle athletes working on this continuously. So when you're doing this drill, focus on driving the heel down into the box or the bench and then driving the opposite knee up. Do a couple sets of this and you will definitely be feeling your hip flexor on one side and your glute and your hamstring on the opposite side. Definitely, unquestionably, S-tier hip flexor movement. Before we get into sets and reps, if you guys are enjoying the video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. It really helps out the channel and we appreciate it. Okay, so now that you know the best exercises for strengthening the hip flexor, how many sets and reps should you do and how should you progress? I would typically recommend starting around 3 to 4 sets of 6 to 8 reps, focusing on strengthening through that lengthened or that extended position. Make sure that you're reaching back to really get that full length each rep and then driving the knee up. There are variations of this drill, so do what's comfortable for you and what also works with the equipment that you have available. For example, you can lean back on a box with one knee hugged into the chest, and this would be a great way to get a very similar effect to the other 2 S-tier drills that we showed you. By hugging that knee into the chest, we're actually posteriorly tilting the hips and getting that hip into full lengthened hip extension. So bottom line is this. Find an exercise that works for you where you can actually challenge the hip flexor in a lengthened position. 3 to 4 sets of 6 to 8 reps, 2 times a week. I would recommend to work this for at least 6 weeks. Do this and I guarantee that you'll be much stronger in your hip flexor compared to doing end range liftoffs or easy band exercises. And this is a great time to thank Animal House Fitness for sponsoring this video. Monkey feet are a great tool to have in your gym, not only for training your hip flexors, but also for the options that it opens up for isolating your hamstrings, your quads, and more. Using the monkey feet is a way more convenient and comfortable than trying to hook your foot onto a kettlebell and hoping it doesn't fall off. It also gives you more options for weight as it can hook onto any dumbbell. And they also make bands like the ones that you saw in this video. I reached out to Animal House Fitness to sponsor this video because they're an awesome small business with quality products. If you're looking to add some tools to your home gym to help you build hip flexor strength and more, head to animalhousefitness.com. If you guys do have any questions about hip flexor strength, or if you have any tips on what's worked for you, drop a comment below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.